A story that is rarely told is that of the Stono Rebellion. This is a story of a group of Africans, their leader Gary, and their decision to revolt against captivity. On September 9th, 1739, they changed the course of history and the treatment of slaves for years to come. There are three main possibilities that led Carolina slaves to feel empowered enough to revolt against their owners. One possible cause for the rebellion was the outbreak of yellow fever and malaria. It was spreading wildly throughout the colony and was killing off white slave owners. The slaves believed that with the dwindling population of slave owners around, there would be less resistance for their attempts to escape. Another possible cause for the rebellion was the knowledge of runaway slaves making it safely to St. Augustine, Florida. The slaves would be granted land and freedom from the Spanish if they could make their journey to Florida from the Carolinas. With the British Empire thinning, the slaves believed now was the best time to escape, since the slave owners would have less military support to prevent the slaves from relocating to Florida. The final possible cause for the Stono Rebellion was the upcoming implementation of the Security Act of 1739, also known as the Charleston Security Act. This act would require all white males to carry firearms 7 days a week. This would limit the slaves' opportunity to escape on Sundays, which was previously as a fearless day of freedom for slaves to worship, procreate, and relax from the 6 long days of working in the fields. It is uncertain how Gary became the leader of the rebellion, but his literacy and knowledge of the Portuguese language helped him rise to power. Gary's warlike strategies led the slaves south to Florida, collecting 21 casualties along the way. In the early morning hours of September 9th, 1739, a group of around 20 slaves gathered and headed to the Hutchinson firearms store, with Gary leading the way. At the store, the slaves killed Mr. Hutchinson and looted the store, arming themselves for their rebellion. Now, well armed, the group headed south, down the main road nearly 20 miles from Charleston, beating their drums and carrying signs of liberty as they sang, "Headed South for Florida." From there, slaves moved southward from one plantation to another, slaughtering whites and burning houses as they went. Men, women, and children were killed, some beheaded, and their heads left for display as slaves continued to head south. As the slaves moved southward, more slaves from plantations willingly joined the rebel forces, while others were forced to join in the rebel cause. The rebel forces continued in a military fashion, displaying a flag and beating drums as they marched to their freedom. Lieutenant Governor William Bull, who was traveling on horseback with 4 companions, happened upon the rebels at about 11 o'clock in the morning. Bull and his companions quickly fled for their own safety. They then alerted the militia and other planters, who then organized men to pursue the insurgents. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they came upon the group of slaves about 10 miles south of Charleston. Some slaves were resting while others were drunk on whiskey they had stolen from the raid. The slaves fought hard, but in the end the militia won the fight and ended the Stono Rebellion, killing as many slaves as possible. In the aftermath of the rebellion, whites in the Carolinas wanted to be ensured that the slave system would be stiffened and hinder slaves from any future outbursts of disorderly conduct. The first step was to get the slaves that had revolted that day and stop the other slaves from joining their ranks. Whites could not readily observe activities within the slave quarters or monitor the social interactions that were a part of the plantation life. But white plantation owners were apparent to the possibility of hiring bondsmen to employ informants within the slave community, which in turn breeded a division among the slave population. After investigation, a legislative committee agreed that Thomas Eliot's slave, July, was chiefly instrumental in saving his master and his family from being destroyed by the rebellious Negroes. and on several occasions he fought bravely against the rebels, along with killing one of them. As a reward for his faithful service, as well as to set an example to other slaves, the committee recommended that July should have his freedom, along with a shirt, a suit, a hat, a pair of stockings, along with a pair of shoes. July was the only slave who received his freedom. After all, freedom was the ultimate reward and had to be used sparingly, for too many blacks with their freedom could rise additional problems for the society in the Carolinas. 30 slaves were cited for their loyalty during the insurrection and rewarded with gifts of clothes and cash payment. 16 slaves, 15 men, and 1 woman received a full suit of clothes and 20 pounds for behaving well during the crisis in opposing the rebel Negroes. The Slave Code of 1740 established rules of conduct for both slaves and whites. Many of the old provisions regarding slavery were reinforced, while numerous new ones were added. Special attention was given to preventing slaves from assembling, also preventing slaves from learning how to read and write, and discouraging them from using hard liquors. The revised slave code stipulated that masters avoid working their slaves on Sunday and providing them with adequate clothing, based on the theory that mistreated and overworked slaves would become menacing slaves. Beginning July 1741, the act taxed incoming slaves 100 pounds per head at a rate of 10 times the regular intended prohibition amount. The higher duty was to be collected for 3 years until July 1744, and it was in hope that the arriving white immigrants would then be able to maintain and change the racial composition of the colony. What actually triggered the Stono Rebellion is not clear. Stono Rebellions was one among the 250 rebellions documented in the Carolinas and later in the southern United States. South Carolina responded to the rebellion by galvanizing an effort to control the behavior of slaves and prevent any further revolts. Stricter slave codes were established with the Negro Act of 1740, dictating such things as how slaves were to be treated, punished, along with dressed. It forbade them from assembling with one another, being taught how to read and write. In 1740, the slave codes were largely unaltered until the emancipation in 1865.